War, the never-changing effect of the unseen wounds in veterans. The main point I'm going to be going over today is going to be the chronological changes of veterans' mental health, returning to society, and how we can help them. The different war periods is going to be one of the things to go over, as we have the First World War, the Second World War, Vietnam War, and then all modern conflicts, including battles in the Middle East. The type of warfare seen in World War I was a lot of trench warfare. It was the first time we've seen modern machine guns and then long-range small arms. These service members would have been coming from very poor backgrounds, as these would be the early days right before the Depression, and a consensus of how the life there was very positive. The veterans came back and they're treated as normal people. Now as we move on to the Second World War, the type of warfare was very different, as in we had our first maneuver warfare, which is based a lot on strategy and moving troops, and essentially catch the enemy of surprise. There were shorter, small arms battles, and there was a lot of island hopping. These types of service members most of them would have been motivated to serve their country, or they would have been drafted, and they've been very tough coming from the Depression and being raised by the World War I veterans themselves. The census that they came back to was a very positive and united nation. Moving forward towards the Vietnam War is when we start to see the veterans are not treated as nicely. The type of warfare was jungle warfare, which is a very unconventional fighting. There's guerrilla fighters coming around, there's booby traps all the time, and there's very hard rules of engagement to figure out. These type of service members were not near as motivated to serve their country, as many of them would have been drafted and been fighting a war that they may not politically believe in. Consensus on their mental health was a very split nation. It was very tense, and this is one of the first times we start to see some of the stereotypes that veterans are kind of gruff and very short and mean. Now, how this ties into modern society, and then what's the emphasis of the speech, is tribal societies of the past and the present, or something that Sebastian Younger had studied for a very long time, being an anthropologist, and then later being a war journaler in a couple of the modern conflicts. Now, some of the things he's seen in the Middle Eastern fighting was that these veterans would be going to these very dangerous environments, and how they'd be spending all their time together was in a lot of ways very similar to ways of life that the people before us lived. The type of warfare that was going on in the Middle East was a lot of unconventional fighting. There was a lot of mountain fighting in Afghanistan, and then there was a lot of urban fighting in like the areas of Iraq where it was house to house, room to room clearing. The rules of engagement were sometimes hard to differentiate, so a lot of times this made people make very hard decisions that will impact them for the rest of their lives. These type of service members often were motivated to serve their country, as there's no real draft going on this time, or they were post 9/11 and they were already motivated to retaliate in the terrorist attacks that they had seen. The general consensus on this mental health was it was a lot easier because the veterans had a lot more mental health, because there was a lot more people that were able to serve them, as essentially the grief they had to deal with had evolved over time. And this originated with first being shell shock back in World War I. This was before the discovery of Captain Charles Myers. He was a medical doctor who requested permission from Army medical leadership to test 3 soldiers with physical symptoms. And it's one of the first times the 100-yard stare was coined from the trenches, and them constantly having to be ready to fight an enemy at any time could jump up out of the trenches and charge towards them. In a lot of ways, this is very similar to the native tribal life also. As the change in diagnostic happened, shell shock started being attributed to other forms of stress and war. It was not just about if there was some kind of ordnance detonation right nearby. And later on, this eventually grows into from shell shock to eventually Vietnam War syndrome, which in a way is very similar. So Vietnam War syndrome was a little bit more broader also, so it got to encompass a little bit more things. It could be just general war weariness and being tired and more of the traumatic effects. And then eventually has transformed into what we have today, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be applied to a lot more military people, and then also, which is new for this disorder versus the other two, was this it could also be applied to civilians, which this allows more medical professionals to have more time to treat people with similar symptoms, which helps them do better at their job, which helps create more doctors and will help more people get help. Something about this term has been new ever since it's been applied. This can apply to almost 30% of the Vietnam service veterans, and this is a lot higher number than it was before. The demographic of most of the service members that have been able to be diagnosed with PTSD was that while a large majority of them come from a combat environment, there were many more, which is almost 3/10 of the military, which is about 30%, that did not serve in any type of combat, but still had some type of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, today's PTSD is very well documented, as it's been a mental issue that affects almost 5 to 20% of veterans ever since 1981, and has slowly went up. Current conflicts have been far more research to determine how PTSD can be carried from modern society under short-term and long-term. Short-term PTSD is very useful for veterans because as they come from these very violent backgrounds, or these backgrounds where they live in such a tight-knit society, it can be very useful to be angry all the time, so you're predisposed to fight, or having nightmares, which can constantly remind you of the dangers around you, or being depressed, so it keeps you out of circulation from others. Now, long-term PTSD is very similar to that, although the trauma is often due to the victim not being able to be relieved from the trauma. Spch100 mentions veterans of Middle Eastern conflicts having a lower chance of committing suicide than their civilian counterpart. And one of the great examples that Spch100 had used in his book was that if you take a lab rat and you put him through massive amounts of trauma and you keep him by himself, he may never recover. Although if you take the same lab rat and you put him with a group of other lab rats, they would never reintroduce to that trauma, then they can successfully reintegrate themselves back to society. Now, how this applies from shell shock to PTSD is that lots of the changes in the mental health and reintegration of society has to be done on our part, as in everybody in the society today. The common denominator with this is the military command structure and the natural societies of tribal communities in the past is very similar, which fosters a similar environment that humans evolved from. Modern society often has to deal with the hardship of technology, as it tends to split people apart, whereas people in older communities would also come from a lot tighter knit group of people. One of the things that modern society has mirrored from other tight knit groups in the past is during times of hardship is usually when tribes would be the closest, and you can see this in other examples, like during the Second World War of the Blitz, where many people that were originally considered to be mentally ill or have other problems will eventually become some of the backbone people, end up helping others in those different situations, and it gave them a feeling of belonging, which eventually actually relieved the trauma that they had before the war. Although war and trauma may never change, we together as a society can build a stronger foundation for veterans to return to, as long as we can agree to reach out and help them.